Can you walk us through what's a demand letter? If a business receives a demand letter, what is it and what should they do immediately?
Well, there's different types of demand letters. There's the what I call the legit demand letters, which are, hey, we have evidence that you've done all of these things wrong. Let's talk about settling this before we have to file a lawsuit, right? And that's usually, they already have wage statements or whatever it is that tells them the employer's done something wrong. Then there's the ones that are suspect to me always, which is, hey, we represent this particular ex-employee or employee or current employee, and we want you to give us all of the records related to this employee. Time records, pay records, those are basically phishing. Let me see if I can find something you've done wrong so I can force you to pay me some money to go away. And what you should do is, first of all, just contact a lawyer. And it really just depends. There's some law firms that are legit law firms. Like I know that they're not taking crap cases, that they have something legitimate before they take them. I also know which law firms will likely, most of them, I don't know everybody, but most of the guys, I know which ones will sue. And there's some that send you a demand letter and sue when you don't give them the right response. There's some that will never sue. They're just constantly sending you more demand letters. So with those, we always just basically string them along. The ones that we know will sue, we try to work it out with them. And then there's some that sue without a demand letter. You just get a lawsuit, So there's guys like that too. Yeah. So when you get a demand letter, read it, forward it on to whoever's representing you, and then let them take care of it from there.
Got it. So that's definitely a really good area to seek good legal counsel immediately.
Yeah, and it's the beginning of what is potentially a lawsuit. So what I always say is try to avoid the lawsuits at all costs, because they'll likely cost you more money. And on top of that, you're going to be spending a year and a half with sleepless nights, wondering if someone's going to attack your bank accounts. And of course they can't without a judgment, but I mean, most people don't know that, right? So it's almost like when you're a kid, right? When you're a kid, I don't know if most women would get this, but most guys would understand this. It's like when the guy tells you, hey, I'm going to meet you outside at 3 and we're going to get into a fight. That's really what litigation is. So anything you can do before 3 o'clock to avoid getting into that fight is what you should do, whether it's apologizing, whether it's whatever it is, right? So that's why the demand letters is like that first threat of potentially there's going to be a fight at 3 o'clock after school, right? And so then it's up to you to try to figure out what to do to get out of it. And a lot of times it's just paying some money. And I understand that people say, well, that's not right. That's not fair. I'd rather fight. I'm not paying a nickel. That's cool. We can do it that way too, but just understand at 3 o'clock, you're going to be in a fight.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate that good, honest business owners can get into trouble without really doing anything wrong.
Yeah, and I hate to get political here, but it's just overregulation, right? And it's every time you add something new into your own business, it creates a whole slew of other problems. But as a business owner, you can see it and you can rectify it or do whatever. The government is not like that. It's big and it takes years to figure out what the result of doing anything is, right? So I'm not saying that the laws are not there for a good reason, but what I'm saying is they may not have been thought through very well, because the result of it is a lot of additional lawsuits, right? That drives businesses out of California, so it hurts the tax base, clogs up the courts, so it creates more cost and expense to the government. It's just all of these things, there's tons of stuff like that, right? I've been reading about the school loan industry. You know what I mean? It's the government decided to not regulate, but back school loans, which then increased the cost of tuition. And then the only ones that made out were colleges, by increasing tuition and setting up degrees that have no that nobody will pay you for once you get out of it, right? So now you've got all these people in debt, you've got the government backing these things, and then you've got the universities walking away with all this money. It's very similar to employment law, right? So you've got the governments that is costing them more money because of these laws. Then you've got business owners that is costing them money, so they're leaving. And then you've got these attorneys on the other side that are just making these windfalls, you know. And I'm not saying that every case is a bad case. Sometimes employers do stuff wrong. It's just, you know, and there's lots of attorneys doing good work out there. But there's enough bad attorneys that are just shakedown guys that it really hurts the system, you know, and not everybody's honest, you know, that's just the bottom line.
Yeah. You know, you made a really good point in your previous videos about severance packages and why it's good to have a severance package, even if it's to an employee that really doesn't deserve one. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, you know what's funny about all relationships with human beings? I've come to notice from having girlfriends and brothers and sisters and whatever else is everybody overestimates their own value and underestimates the other person's value. That's just human nature, right? So even bad employees think they're good employees. You know, believe it or not. I mean, there's some that are reasonable and realistic, but most of them don't even realize that they're bad employees. And there's things that employees do at work that they wouldn't even do at home, which is funny to me, right? So anytime you fire someone, their initial reaction is always, I'm going to get you back, or I've got rights to, and because people think they deserve this or that they've given so much to this company, they don't realize that that at the lowest level of this is just an exchange. I'm basically willing to pay you this much money in exchange for your time and skills, and you're willing to accept that much money for that. But sometimes it's just not a good fit, right? But that's not how humans react to it. They don't react like robots, obviously, right? So you can't just turn them off. And the climate in California is such that even if you didn't do anything wrong, it's going to cost you so much money to prove you didn't do something wrong. It makes sense just to have a severance agreement. And a severance agreement is simple. It's just saying, hey, this isn't working out, right? I'm not going to go after you for anything. And sometimes the employees have done something wrong. Sometimes they haven't. Sometimes they're just bad employees and you can't sue them for that. But sometimes they've embezzled. Sometimes they've stolen things. Who knows what, right? So with a severance agreement, you say, I'm not going to sue you. You're not going to sue me for anything. And on top of that, I'm going to give you either 2 weeks or a month's pay or whatever it is, whatever you guys decide on. And on top of that, they can try to collect unemployment or whatever. And that's not up to you whether they get it or not, right? So with a severance agreement, sure, you might end up paying a few $1,000s, right? If even a high-level employee, let's say it costs you $5,000 for 2 weeks. If you get a lawsuit, just the retainer alone is going to be 10. So already you've doubled your injury, right? You've doubled what you've paid for a severance, right? And that's not even counting however long this lawsuit takes, right? And remember, people can sue for anything. So with $5,000, you've paid something. There's a tax deduction on it. And on top of that, you have the peace of mind. Okay, I don't have any problems with this employee. So I always recommend to my clients, if you're terminating anybody or laying them off, do a severance if you can. If it's somebody that's like, hey, you know, I'm leaving because I'm moving out of state, or I'm decided to go back to school, or you don't have to give them a severance. Typically, chances of them coming back at you is probably fairly small. But anybody else is just worth it. Just write it off on your taxes. Yeah. Pay that guy the $5,000 instead of the government.
That is invaluable advice right there, and that was one video that I heard you that a light bulb went on. That hey, you know, getting good legal advice, these little things you don't really read anywhere else. You know, it takes years of experience. So the restaurant industry is unique in that there's a large employee base with a lot of turnover. from your experience, what are the common areas that restaurants get themselves in trouble with respect to employment law?
Restaurants, what a tough business. You know what movie I was watching a couple of weeks ago? It's a great movie. I've seen it maybe 3 times. Waiting. You know that movie?
Never heard of it.
It's with Ryan Reynolds before he was famous, and it's about like a restaurant that's kind of like a TGI Fridays. Like these guys all work together. They fool around. They date each other. They party with each other after work or whatever. And I'm watching this. I hadn't seen it in years, and I was watching it. And I was like, oh man, look at all that liability in a restaurant. And this particular movie was written by this guy. I can't remember his name, but it was based on his experience in the restaurant industry when he was, I think he was living in LA trying to be a writer, and then he wrote this script because it was so interesting. Restaurants have just a ton of liability, just a ton. And it's great. You know, there's lots of restaurants, but I don't know. I just don't know why people open restaurants. Maybe if you're a chef or something, but man, there's just so much liability in a restaurant. The biggest liability is sexual harassment, especially if it's a bar sort of restaurant, right? You've got all these, especially in LA, you've got all these young, good-looking people that are going to be actors one day that are drinking and partying and working together, you know, and they get very familiar with each other. Imagine a third of your life is spent with these people. You get close to them very quickly, right? So it doesn't take much for a sexual harassment claim, for you know, any type of harassment claim, because people get to know each other. They start joking around with each other. I did a video on and this wasn't my case. It was one of my friends who is in-house counsel at a big company that was saying, you know, in the kitchen, it was a bunch of young Latinos using the N-word because that's, you know, in our culture these days, it's everybody's using that word, I guess, you know, because of music and whatever else. And they were Spanish speaking, all in the kitchen, all Latinos, all Spanish speaking, using the N-word as they joked around with each other. And one of the wait staff was a young African American woman, and she got fired for something completely different, but then came back and sued based on harassment, even though she had never complained about it or, you know, anything else. And it's easy to prove that they were using that word. The video's there, right? So of course the employer is liable for this. The other big one with restaurants is wage and hour stuff, you know, because they don't want to take their 10-minute breaks because it's too busy. Well, then that's the employer's fault because they didn't have enough staff, right? You know, missed lunch breaks. Sometimes it's just too busy. They've got to take the lunch break. Swing shifts, not swing shifts, split shifts are another big one. Most people don't realize that you have to pay for an extra hour for split shifts, and so that becomes liability. There's just so much, and then on top of that, all the workers' comp claims that come out of restaurants. You know, restaurants are tough. You know, it's a tough business to be in, and I'm sure those guys do it for the love, not for the money, because I don't know how else you would get into that business. Very, very low margins and lots of risk, but there's ways around it too, you know?
Yeah. So you mentioned sexual harassment. What can employers do to protect themselves from something like that? I mean, you're not involved. You know, there wasn't any complaints. Is there any policies that they can have, training available that can reduce the risk of something bad happening?
Well, it starts with training the supervisors or anybody that's in management, right? First of all, they should be trained what is and what isn't. Second of all, they should be setting a really good example and not joking around and potentially, being part of that harassment. And then third, enforcing it. So just like, hey, don't joke around like that, you know, or hey, don't use that word, or hey, that's not what we do here. Hey, I know you guys are dating, but in the workplace, you know, no touching or whatever. But that's probably the best ways. Training management is important for several reasons. First of all, to kind of enforce the rules, but second of all, because there's strict liability for management. So if you're in a supervisory position and let's say you were hitting on someone that was below you, they don't even have to complain. They don't have to say, hey, this guy's hitting on me, and there's automatic liability. Whereas if they're at the same level and they didn't complain, then it's questionable whether there's liability or not. I mean, you probably still have to settle just because of the expense, but at least the argument would be like, she never complained about anything, or he never complained about anything. We didn't know about this. Then the liability considerably diminishes, right? Unless, of course, they'll be arguing, yes, we told this supervisor, or we did this, or we couldn't because of whatever reason. But it makes it tougher to have a sexual harassment claim. So I think the key is the supervisors. California law requires training now anyway for sexual harassment annually, starting, I think they have to finish up by January 1, 2020. And so I think you start with the supervisors, you make it very clear what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And then I think you know, for sexual harassment, I think you have insurance. You know, there's EPLI insurance that covers things like harassment, discrimination, things like that. And then EPLI doesn't generally cover wage and hour stuff. So the wage and hour stuff, you just got to be on top of it.
Mm-hmm.